The grand ballroom of the Riverside Convention Center buzzed with excitement. Television cameras lined the walls, their red lights blinking like curious eyes. Over 300 people filled the velvet seats, whispering and pointing at the stage where two cooking stations stood side by side. This was the final episode of Kitchen Masters, the most popular cooking show in the country, and everyone knew they were about to witness something special. Marcus Chen stood at the judges' table, his silver hair perfectly styled, his chef's coat pressed and spotless. He was a legend in the culinary world. 3 Michelin stars decorated his restaurants, and his cookbook had sold millions of copies worldwide. Food critics called him a genius. Other chefs studied his techniques like students preparing for final exams. Tonight, he would face a challenger in a charity cook-off, and everyone assumed it would be an easy victory for the master, the host. A cheerful woman named Diana Roberts stepped onto the stage with a microphone in hand. Her red dress sparkled under the bright lights. She smiled at the audience, building the tension with practiced ease. The charity event had raised over $2 million already, and this final showdown would determine which cause would receive an additional $500,000 bonus. The stakes were high, but more than that, pride was on the line. Marcus stood confidently at his cooking station, reviewing the premium ingredients laid out before him. Fresh lobster, imported truffles, aged beef, exotic spices from around the world. His fingers moved across the items like a pianist checking his keys before a concert. He had prepared for this moment, planning a dish that would demonstrate why he was considered the best. His mind raced through techniques perfected over 30 years of cooking in the finest kitchens of Paris, Tokyo, and New York. Then Diana announced the challenger, and the room fell silent with curiosity. She gestured toward the side entrance, and everyone turned to look. Through the doors walked a man who seemed completely out of place in a cooking competition. He wore the formal uniform of the Royal Palace Guard, complete with gold buttons and ceremonial medals across his chest. His name was James Peterson, and he had served at the palace for 15 years, standing watch over presidents and prime ministers during state dinners. The audience murmured in confusion. Some laughed nervously, thinking this must be some kind of joke. A palace guard competing against Marcus Chen? It seemed absurd, like asking a librarian to race against an Olympic sprinter. James walked calmly to his cooking station, his military posture straight and dignified. His face showed no nervousness, no doubt. He simply nodded respectfully to Marcus, who returned the gesture with a small, confident smile that suggested he already knew the outcome. What the audience did not know was James's secret. For 15 years, he had stood guard outside the palace kitchen during those elaborate state dinners. While other guards dreaded the long hours of standing still, James loved those shifts. Through the kitchen doors, he could hear the symphony of cooking. Pans sizzling, knives chopping, chefs calling out orders in French and Italian. During his breaks, the palace chefs had welcomed him in, teaching him their secrets, letting him taste dishes prepared for kings and queens. James had learned from masters who cooked for royalty. They taught him not just recipes, but the soul of cooking. How to respect ingredients, how to let flavors speak for themselves, how to cook with heart instead of ego. On his days off, he practiced in his small apartment kitchen, recreating dishes from memory, experimenting with techniques, studying cookbooks until dawn. His fellow guards thought he was strange, but James had found his passion. He pursued it with the same discipline he brought to his military service. Diana explained the rules to the crowd. Both competitors would have 90 minutes to prepare a complete 3-course meal. The judges would score based on taste, presentation, creativity, and technique. The ingredients were premium quality, and both stations had access to the same items. It would be a fair fight. Skill against skill, experience against experience. The winner would not only claim victory, but would also direct the bonus. Donation to their chosen charity. Marcus had chosen a children's hospital foundation. James had selected a veterans organization that helped former soldiers transition to civilian life. Both causes were worthy, which made the competition even more meaningful. This was not just about cooking anymore. This was about honor, purpose, and making a difference. The audience sat forward in their seats, programs forgotten in their laps. All eyes on the stage. The clock started, and both men moved into action. Marcus worked with the fluid grace of someone who had done this 1,000 times. His hands were steady, his movements efficient. He began preparing his first course, a delicate seafood appetizer that would showcase his classical training. The lobster went into a pot of boiling water infused with herbs. His knife work was mesmerizing as he diced vegetables into perfect tiny cubes, each one exactly the same size. James approached his station differently. He took a moment, closed his eyes, and seemed to say a quiet prayer, or perhaps just center himself. Then he began, and something changed in the room. There was a gentleness to his movements, a respect for each ingredient he touched. He handled the vegetables like they were precious, the meat like it was a gift. Where Marcus worked with precision, James worked with love. The difference was subtle, but somehow visible to those watching closely. The cameras captured every moment. Close-ups of hands chopping, flames leaping from pans, concentration on faces. The judges watched carefully, making notes. In the audience, opinions were already forming. Some people were impressed by Marcus's obvious expertise and confidence. Others found themselves drawn to James's unexpected presence, curious about what this quiet palace guard would create. The room filled with the aroma of cooking food, and mouths began to water. 30 minutes passed, and both first courses were taking shape. Marcus plated his appetizer with artistic precision, creating a masterpiece that looked like it belonged in a museum. Microgreens arranged just so, sauce drizzled in elegant patterns, the lobster meat glistening under the lights. It was beautiful, undeniably beautiful. The judges nodded appreciatively when he presented it, already impressed before taking a single bite. James presented his first course moments later. It was simpler in appearance, less decorated, but there was something honest about it. A perfectly seared scallop resting on a bed of creamy risotto, garnished with fresh herbs from a small garden he maintained on his apartment balcony. The judges looked at it, then at each other. It did not have Marcus's polish, but it had something else. Something that made them lean forward with genuine interest, forks already in hand. Ready to discover what this surprising challenger had created? The judges began with Marcus's appetizer. Head judge Catherine Williams, herself a renowned chef with 2 decades of experience, lifted her fork carefully. The lobster looked perfect, cooked to an exact temperature that would make it tender but not rubbery. She placed the bite in her mouth, chewed slowly, and her expression remained professionally neutral. The other 2 judges followed, nodding politely as they tasted. They wrote notes on their scorecards, but their faces showed respect rather than amazement. Catherine spoke first, her voice measured and professional. "The lobster was cooked beautifully," she said. "The technique was flawless, the presentation stunning. Everything was exactly as it should be from a chef of Marcus's caliber." The other judges agreed, praising the classical approach and perfect execution. Marcus smiled and bowed slightly, confident in his expertise. He had delivered exactly what was expected, and he knew it. This was his world, and he moved through it like a king in his castle. Then the judges turned to James's plate. The scallop sat there, less decorated but somehow inviting. Catherine picked up her fork again, this time with visible curiosity. She had judged hundreds of competitions, tasted thousands of dishes, and she prided herself on being impossible to surprise. But something about this simple plate made her pause. She took a bite, and her eyes widened. The other judges noticed her reaction and quickly tasted their portions. Silence fell over the judges' table. Not the polite silence of professional consideration, but the stunned silence of genuine surprise. Catherine set down her fork and looked at James. Really looked at him for the first time. She asked him a question that everyone heard through the microphone. Where did he learn to cook like this? James answered simply, honestly. From palace chefs during his guard duties, from cookbooks in his free time, from practice and passion and a love for bringing joy through food, the scallop was perfect. But that was not what shocked them. Many chefs could cook a scallop perfectly. It was something deeper, something in the flavor that spoke of care and understanding. The risotto was creamy without being heavy, flavored with a subtle herb combination that enhanced rather than overwhelmed. Each element supported the others, creating harmony on the plate. Catherine used a word that made the audience lean forward: soulful. She said the dish had soul. Marcus's confident smile flickered for just a moment. He recovered quickly, returning to his cooking station to begin the second course. But that tiny moment of doubt had appeared, and some in the audience had seen it. The master chef had expected an easy victory, a pleasant evening of demonstrating his superiority for a good cause. Now something unexpected was happening. Uncertainty crept into his movements like a shadow at sunset. The second course would be the main dish, the heart of the meal. This was where chefs showed their true skill, where complexity and technique combined with flavor and presentation. Marcus chose to prepare a dish he had perfected over years: a perfectly cooked beef tenderloin with a red wine reduction, truffle mashed potatoes, and roasted seasonal vegetables. It was a classic for a reason. A dish that had impressed critics and celebrities alike in his restaurants. He worked with renewed focus, determined to remind everyone why he was the master. His knife cut through the tenderloin with surgical precision, creating medallions of exactly the same thickness. The meat went into a screaming hot pan, searing with a satisfying sizzle. He prepared his sauce with practiced movements, reducing wine with shallots and herbs, adding butter at exactly the right moment to create a glossy, rich coating. Everything was textbook perfect, exactly as it should be. James stood at his station, looking at his ingredients with quiet contemplation. He picked up a chicken, a simple whole chicken, that seemed almost humble compared to Marcus's premium beef. In the audience, some people exchanged glances. Was the palace guard really going to compete with chicken against aged beef tenderloin? It seemed like bringing a bicycle to a car race. But James had a plan, a recipe taught to him by an elderly palace chef who had learned it. From her grandmother, he began to prepare the chicken with movements that looked almost ceremonial. He seasoned it not just with salt and pepper, but with a blend of herbs and spices that filled the air with an aroma that made people in the front rows close their eyes and breathe deeply. He stuffed the cavity with lemon, garlic, and fresh rosemary. His hands massaged the seasonings into the skin with a gentleness that seemed strange for such a simple task, but somehow felt right. While Marcus created his elaborate sauce, James did something different. He remembered a lesson from Chef Marie, the palace's oldest cook who had retired last year. She had told him that cooking was not about impressing people with complexity. It was about respecting ingredients, understanding flavors, and cooking with intention. She said the best dishes were often the simplest, because simplicity had nowhere to hide mistakes. It demanded perfection in basics, rather than distraction through decoration. James roasted his chicken with care, basting it regularly, watching the skin turn golden brown. He prepared sides that seemed simple but required deep understanding. Roasted root vegetables seasoned with honey and thyme, a creamy polenta that took patience and constant stirring, a pan sauce made from the chicken drippings that captured the essence of the bird. Nothing fancy, nothing that would make headlines, but everything done with absolute attention and respect. The clock ticked down. 45 minutes remaining. Both men worked steadily, but the atmosphere had changed. Marcus glanced over at James's station more frequently now, trying to understand how this guard had created that shocking first course. James never looked at Marcus's station. He stayed focused on his own work, lost in the meditation of cooking, present in each moment, in each decision. The cameras captured the contrast between them. Marcus, precise, efficient, confident in his training and reputation. James, thoughtful, gentle, cooking like he was preparing a meal for someone he loved. The audience watched both screens, comparing and contrasting, forming opinions and changing them again. This was not going as anyone had expected, and the uncertainty made it thrilling. In the audience, food critic named Robert Martinez sat forward in his seat, his notepad forgotten. He had attended this event expecting to write a predictable story about Marcus Chen's inevitable victory. Now he was witnessing something else entirely, something that challenged his assumptions about cooking and mastery. He had spent his career celebrating chefs who trained in the finest schools, who could name every classical French technique, who had worked in Michelin-starred kitchens. But what if mastery could come from somewhere else? What if passion and dedication could rival formal training? Marcus plated his beef tenderloin with artistic flair. The medallions were perfectly medium rare, with a beautiful crust on the outside. His truffle mashed potatoes were piped in an elegant swirl. The vegetables were arranged like a painting, each element placed with intention. The red wine sauce was drizzled across the plate in a pattern that looked effortless, but had taken years to master. It was a dish worthy of his reputation. It was beautiful and technically flawless. James carved his roasted chicken with steady hands. He plated it simply, letting the golden brown skin speak for itself. The vegetables surrounded the chicken like old friends gathering around a table. The polenta was smooth and creamy, the pan sauce dark and rich. There were no artistic flourishes, no decorative elements. Just honest food, cooked with skill and heart, presented with quiet confidence. He delivered his plate to the judges and stepped back, his military posture straight, his face calm. Catherine looked at both plates before her. On one side, Marcus's technical masterpiece. On the other, James's humble offering. She knew that judging fairly meant looking beyond presentation, beyond reputation, beyond expectations. It meant tasting with an open mind and honest palate. She picked up her knife and fork, preparing to discover which approach to cooking would prove superior, the master's precision or the guard's passion. The judges started with Marcus's beef tenderloin, as protocol demanded they alternate between competitors. Catherine cut into the meat, and it yielded perfectly, revealing a rosy pink center that demonstrated textbook cooking precision. She took a bite, her expression thoughtful and professional. The other judges followed, cutting, tasting, considering. They nodded appreciatively, making notes on their scorecards with careful attention. Marcus's dish was exactly what everyone expected. The beef was tender and flavorful, cooked to perfect medium rare throughout each medallion. The truffle mashed potatoes were rich and creamy, with that distinctive earthy aroma that made them luxurious. The red wine sauce complemented the meat beautifully, adding depth without overwhelming. The vegetables were cooked precisely, maintaining their texture and natural sweetness. It was a masterclass in classical technique. The kind of dish that defined fine dining. Catherine spoke first, praising the technical execution. She noted the perfect sear, the consistent cooking temperature, the balanced flavors. The other judges agreed, using words like excellent, refined, and sophisticated. Marcus accepted the praise with a gracious nod, but his eyes kept drifting toward James's plate. That first course had rattled him more than he wanted to admit, and doubt had planted itself in his mind like an unwelcome guest. Then the judges turned, their attention to the roasted chicken. The simplicity of it seemed almost bold in comparison to Marcus's elaborate presentation. Catherine cut through the golden skin, and even that small action revealed something special. The skin crackled with perfect crispness, giving way to meat that was impossibly moist and tender. She placed the bite in her mouth, and once again, her expression changed in a way that made the entire audience hold their breath. The judges tasted in silence, but their faces told a story, eyes closed in appreciation. Small sounds of pleasure that were picked up by the sensitive microphones. They tasted the polenta, the vegetables, the rich pan sauce made from the chicken drippings. Each element was simple, but together they created something that transcended the sum of their parts. This was not just food. This was a memory of home, a feeling of comfort, a taste of love made edible. Catherine set down her fork slowly, as if unwilling to let the experience end. She looked at James with an expression that mixed surprise with something deeper, something like recognition. She said the chicken was extraordinary, but not because of complexity or fancy techniques. It was extraordinary because it was perfect in its honesty. Every flavor was clear and true. Nothing was hidden behind elaborate sauces or trendy preparations. It was cooking stripped down to its essence, and that essence was magnificent. The second judge, a man named Thomas Bradley who owned a popular restaurant in the city, spoke next. His voice carried emotion that professional critics usually avoided. He said that in 30 years of eating in the finest restaurants around the world, he'd rarely tasted something that moved him like this chicken. It reminded him of why he had fallen in love with cooking as a child. Watching his grandmother in her kitchen, learning that food was about more than just eating. It was about connection, memory, and love. The third judge, a food writer named Lisa Chen, wiped at her eyes discreetly. She apologized with a small laugh, saying she had not expected to get emotional over roasted chicken. But there was something in the dish that touched her heart. Perhaps it was the care evident in every bite, or the way the simple ingredients had been elevated through perfect technique and genuine passion. Whatever it was, she felt grateful to have tasted it. The audience erupted in unexpected applause. This was not the polite clapping usually given to competitors during cooking shows. This was genuine appreciation, the kind of response usually reserved for concerts or theatrical performances. People were standing, some with tears in their eyes, others with huge smiles. They had come expecting to watch a master chef easily defeat an amateur. Instead, they were witnessing something they had not anticipated: true artistry from an unexpected source. Marcus stood at his station, stunned. He had cooked a technically perfect dish, executed with the skill developed over 3 decades of professional experience. He had used premium ingredients and classical techniques. Everything had gone exactly as planned. Yet somehow, his palace guard, with his simple roasted chicken, had created something that resonated more deeply with the judges and audience. It did not make sense according to everything Marcus had learned about cooking and competition, for the first time in years. Marcus Chen felt something he had almost forgotten: humility. He looked at James, really looked at him, seeing not a competitor or a challenge to his reputation, but a fellow cook who loved food with a purity that Marcus had perhaps lost somewhere along his journey to fame. When had cooking become about impressing critics rather than nourishing souls? When had he started focusing more on Michelin stars than on the simple joy of feeding people? The competition moved to the final round, dessert. This was often where competitions were won or lost, where creativity and technical skill combined in sweet harmony. Marcus had planned an elaborate creation, deconstructed lemon tart with nitrogen-frozen elements and delicate sponge sugar decorations. It was modern, cutting-edge. It's a kind of dessert that food magazines photographed and other chefs tried to recreate. He began his preparations with renewed determination. But something had shifted inside him. The certainty he always carried had developed cracks. His hands still moved with expertise, but his mind was troubled. He kept thinking about that chicken, about the way the judges had responded, about the emotion in the audience's applause. What was he missing? What did this guard understand about cooking that Marcus, with all his training and accolades, had somehow forgotten? James approached his final course with the same quiet confidence he had shown throughout the competition. He had chosen to make something that held deep meaning for him, a bread pudding recipe taught to him by Chef Marie before she retired from the palace. She had made it for staff meals, for late nights when the guard rotation changed, for moments when comfort was needed more than sophistication. It was not fancy, not trendy. It's not something that would ever appear on a fine dining menu. He prepared it with the same care he had shown in every dish. Day-old bread torn into pieces, soaked in a custard made with vanilla beans he had split and scraped himself. Cinnamon and nutmeg, measured by feel rather than precise measurement. Because some things were better learned through intuition than formulas. He added dark chocolate chips, not expensive single-origin chocolate, but good quality chips that would melt into pockets of richness throughout the pudding. While Marcus used liquid nitrogen and created architectural sugar sculptures. James stirred his custard gently, making sure every piece of bread absorbed the sweet mixture. While Marcus plated his dessert with tweezers and precision tools, James spooned his bread pudding into bowls with generous portions, topping each with a simple vanilla sauce made from scratch. The contrast between their approaches had never been more apparent. The clock showed 15 minutes remaining. Both men worked steadily, focused on their final presentations. The audience watched the screens, seeing 2 completely different philosophies of cooking playing out side by side. Marcus represented the modern culinary world, technical, innovative, visually stunning. James represented something older, something that existed before cooking became a competitive sport. Nourishment, comfort, connection. Diana, the host, moved around the stage with her microphone, building tension for the cameras. She interviewed audience members, asking for predictions about who would win. The responses were mixed now. no longer the unanimous expectation of Marcus's victory. Some people still believed the master chef's expertise would prevail. Others had been won over by James's emotional cooking. His ability to create profound experiences from simple ingredients. Marcus finished his dessert first. As expected, given his years of professional experience working under time pressure, his creation was stunning. A work of art that looked almost too beautiful to eat. The nitrogen-frozen elements created dramatic smoke effects. The spun sugar caught the light like delicate glass. Every element was precisely placed. Every angle considered. It was a dessert that would photograph perfectly. It would make people gasp in admiration. James finished moments later, his presentation humble in comparison. The bread pudding sat in simple white bowls, steam rising gently from the warm dessert. The vanilla sauce pooled around the edges, and a small mint leaf provided the only decoration. It looked like something a grandmother might serve, like comfort food, elevated through perfect execution and genuine care. Nothing about it screamed for attention, yet somehow it drew the eye anyway. Both men stepped back from their stations as the clock reached 0. The competition portion was complete. Now came the judgment, the moment when 3 professionals would decide which approach to cooking deserved victory. The audience sat in absolute silence, the kind of silence that only comes when something important is about to happen. When the outcome matters more than anyone had anticipated when they walked into the room. The judges received both desserts at the same time, 2 vastly different interpretations of the final course. Catherine looked at Marcus's architectural creation with professional appreciation. Recognizing the hours of practice required to achieve such precision, the nitrogen-frozen elements still released wisps of dramatic smoke, creating an almost magical effect under the stage lights. It was undeniably impressive, the kind of dessert that defined modern gastronomy. She tasted it carefully, her spoon breaking through the delicate sugar sculpture to reach the lemon components beneath. The flavors were bright and clean, perfectly balanced between sweet and tart. The textures were interesting, contrasting creamy and crunchy, cold and room temperature. It was intellectual food, the kind of dish that made diners think and discuss, that sparked conversations about technique and innovation. Marcus had demonstrated why he was considered one of the best in the world. The other judges tasted and nodded, making their notes with thoughtful expressions. Thomas praised the technical achievement, noting the difficulty of working with nitrogen and sugar in a competition setting. Lisa admired the boldness of the presentation, the way Marcus had transformed simple lemon tart into something avant-garde. They were impressed, genuinely impressed, and their scores reflected the skill on display. Then Catherine turned to James's bread pudding, and her expression softened in a way that was visible even to people in the back rows. The warm dessert released the aroma of vanilla, cinnamon, and chocolate, filling the air with a scent that made people think of childhood, of safety, of home. She took a spoonful, and before it even reached her mouth, she smiled. Not the professional smile of a judge evaluating a dish, but the involuntary smile of someone about to experience something wonderful. The first bite made her close her eyes. The bread pudding was perfect in ways that defied technical analysis. The custard was silky and rich, without being heavy. The bread had soaked up the flavors while maintaining just enough texture to provide substance. The chocolate chips had melted into pockets of dark sweetness that contrasted beautifully with the vanilla. The sauce added another layer of comfort, like a warm embrace on a cold day. Thomas and Lisa tasted their portions, and the same transformation happened. Their professional demeanor cracked, revealing the food lovers beneath the critics. Thomas made a sound of pure pleasure, not caring that his microphone picked it up. Lisa took another bite immediately, then another, as if she could not help herself. They had tasted countless desserts in their careers, from the most elaborate creations in the world's finest restaurants, but this simple bread pudding affected them differently, Catherine spoke. And her voice carried weight that silenced the murmuring audience completely. She said that Marcus's dessert was a triumph of modern technique, showcase of skill and innovation that deserved recognition. But James's bread pudding was something else entirely. It was a reminder of why people cooked in the first place. Before restaurants and reviews and competitions, it was food that nourished not just the body, but the soul. That created feelings of comfort and joy that no amount of technical wizardry could replicate. She paused, looking at both competitors with respect and honesty. She said that in her 20 years as a professional chef and judge, she had learned that the highest form of cooking was not about impressing people. It was about touching them, about creating moments of genuine happiness through food. Technical skill mattered, presentation mattered, but they were tools in service of something greater. The connection between the cook and the person eating. The judges conferred quietly, their heads together as they reviewed their scorecards and discussed their evaluations. The audience waited, barely breathing, knowing they were about to witness something significant. Marcus stood straight at his station, his face composed, but his hands gripping the counter edge with white knuckles. James remained in his military posture, calm and centered, looking like he was prepared to accept whatever outcome was coming. Diana approached the judges' table to collect the final scores. The camera zoomed in on her face as she read the cards, her eyes widening slightly at what she saw. She returned to center stage, envelope in hand, building the moment with practiced showmanship. But even she seemed affected by the emotion in the room, by the realization that this competition had become about something more than winning and losing. Before announcing the winner, Diana asked both competitors to join her at center stage. Marcus and James walked toward her, meeting in the middle of the cooking area. For a moment they stood facing each other, these two men from such different worlds who had both found their way to cooking. Marcus extended his hand first, and James shook it firmly. Their eyes meeting with mutual respect, Diana spoke about the competition, praising both men for their incredible performances. She talked about the money raised for charity, reminding everyone that regardless of who won, both causes would benefit from this evening. The audience applauded, grateful for the reminder of the event's larger purpose. But everyone still wanted to know who had won this extraordinary battle between the master chef and the palace guard. The scores were close, Diana revealed, much closer than anyone had anticipated. Both competitors had performed at exceptional levels, creating meals that demonstrated deep understanding of food and cooking. The first course had been strong for both, with Marcus's technical excellence meeting James's surprising depth. The main course had elevated James slightly. But Marcus's dessert had shown the innovation expected from a world-class chef. Then Diana paused. And in that pause, everyone understood that the next words would change everything. She announced that the judges had made their decision, scoring based on the complete dining experience. Taste, technique, presentation, and that intangible quality that made food memorable. The winner, by a narrow margin that reflected how difficult the decision had been, was James Peterson, the Royal Palace Guard, who had learned to cook through passion and dedication. The audience exploded. People jumped to their feet, applauding and cheering with an enthusiasm that shook the convention center. Some were crying, moved by the underdog story, by the validation of passion over pedigree. Others simply appreciated having witnessed something extraordinary, competition that had transcended sport to become genuinely meaningful. The noise was deafening, overwhelming, a release of emotion that had been building throughout the evening. James stood frozen, seeming unable to process what had just happened. His military composure finally cracked, and tears streamed down his face as the reality sank in. He had not just competed with Marcus Chen. He had won. He had defeated a legend, not through luck or trickery, but through honest cooking that came from his heart. Diana handed him the winner's trophy, and he held it like it was made of glass, precious and fragile and unbelievable. Marcus watched James accept the victory, and a complex mix of emotions played across his face. Disappointment, certainly, because he had expected to win, and his pride was wounded. But there was something else too, something that looked almost like relief. He had been carrying the weight of perfection for so long, the pressure to always be the best, to never show weakness. In losing, especially losing to someone like James, he had been freed from something he had not even realized was imprisoning him. He walked over to James and embraced him, genuinely embraced him, while the audience applauded even louder. Marcus spoke into James's ear, words that only the two of them heard. But his expression showed they were words of congratulation and respect. When they separated, Marcus was smiling. A real smile that reached his eyes in a way that Photographs from his restaurants never captured. The judges stood and applauded as well. Joining the standing ovation that continued for several minutes, Catherine approached James with her hand extended, telling him that his cooking had reminded her why she had fallen in love with food in the first place. Thomas shook his hand with enthusiasm, already asking if James had ever considered opening a restaurant. Lisa hugged him, no longer worried about professional distance, just happy to have witnessed something special. Diana tried to conduct the closing segment of the show, but the emotion in the room made it difficult. She announced that James's chosen charity, the Veterans Organization, would receive the bonus $500,000, bringing their total for the evening to unprecedented heights. She praised both competitors again, emphasizing that the real winners were the charities and everyone who had attended or watched this extraordinary event. As the show concluded and cameras stopped rolling, people swarmed toward the stage, wanting to meet James, to congratulate him, to ask him questions. How had he learned to cook? Would he give lessons? Could they get his recipes? He answered everyone with the same humble honesty he had shown throughout the competition. Seeming genuinely surprised that people cared about his story, Marcus stood to the side, watching the celebration with thoughtful eyes. Food critics and journalists approached him for comments, expecting him to be bitter or defensive about his loss. Instead, he surprised them by praising James's cooking with sincerity, admitting that he had learned something important tonight about the true nature of culinary mastery. The convention center slowly emptied as midnight approached, but small clusters of people remained, reluctant to let the evening end. Marcus found a quiet corner backstage, away from the lingering reporters and excited fans. He sat on a folding chair, still wearing his chef's coat, and for the first time in years, he allowed himself to simply think without the pressure of maintaining his image. A shadow fell across him, and he looked up to find James standing there, trophy still in hand, looking uncertain. The palace guard had removed his ceremonial jacket, and in his simple white shirt, he looked less like a competition winner and more like a man who had stumbled into someone else's dream. He asked if he could sit, and Marcus gestured to the empty chair beside him. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, two cooks who had just shared something profound. Finally, Marcus spoke, his voice quieter than it had been all evening. He told James that the loss had hurt, that his ego had taken a beating it probably needed. But more than the hurt, he felt something unexpected: gratitude. James had reminded him of something essential that he had buried. Beneath years of pursuing perfection and praise, James listened, his military training making him comfortable with silence and careful with words. He said he had not come to the competition expecting to win, or even to compete seriously with someone of Marcus's caliber. He had come because the veterans' charity meant everything to him, because his fellow guards who had transitioned to civilian life struggled in ways most people could not imagine. Winning would help them, and that had been worth the risk of public embarrassment. Marcus asked the question that had been burning in his mind since the first course. How had James learned to cook with such soul, such depth of feeling? The palace guard smiled, a gentle expression that softened his stern military features. He explained that cooking had saved him in a way. The long hours of guard duty, the rigid discipline, the constant alertness had been wearing him down. Then he discovered the palace kitchen, and suddenly he had found purpose beyond protocol. He talked about Chef Marie, the elderly woman who had taken him under her wing during late-night shifts. She had been cooking for royalty for 40 years, but she told him that the most important meals she ever made were the simple staff dinners, the food she prepared for tired workers who needed nourishment and comfort. She taught him that cooking was an act of service, of love, and that the best cooks were those who understood they were caring for people, not just feeding them. Marcus absorbed these words, feeling them resonate with memories he had pushed aside. He remembered his own grandmother's kitchen in Taiwan before he moved to America to pursue his culinary dreams. She had cooked 3 meals a day for a large family, never using recipes, never worrying about presentation. But everyone had gathered at her table with joy, and the food had tasted like home. When had he stopped cooking like that? When had perfection replaced connection? James stood, preparing to leave, but Marcus stopped him with a question that surprised them both. Would James be willing to cook with him sometime? Not a competition, not for cameras or judges, just to people who loved food, sharing a kitchen and learning from each other. James's face lit up with a smile that transformed him from military guard to excited student. He said yes immediately, adding that he would be honored beyond words. They exchanged phone numbers, both knowing that this was not just polite gesture, but genuine intention. Something had shifted between them during the competition, recognition that they each possessed something the other needed. Marcus had the technical knowledge and experience. James had the heart and soul. Together, they might discover a way of cooking that honored both, as James finally left to join his fellow guards who had waited to celebrate with him. Marcus remained seated, turning over the evening's events in his mind. His phone buzzed constantly with messages from colleagues, reporters, social media notifications. His loss was already becoming news in the culinary world. Some messages offered condolences, others asked for interviews. A few contained thinly veiled schadenfreude from competitors, who enjoyed seeing the mighty brought down. He turned off his phone and sat in the quiet backstage area, listening to the cleaning crew begin their work in the main hall. Tomorrow, he would return to his restaurants, to his responsibilities and reputation. But tonight, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what had happened. He had lost a competition, but gained something more valuable. A reminder of why he had fallen in love with cooking in the first place. Before the Michelin stars and cookbook deals and television appearances, Catherine found him there an hour later. Preparing to leave the venue, she sat beside him without asking, and they shared another comfortable silence. Finally, she told him that his dessert had been technically superior to James's bread pudding. The scores had been close because both men had cooked brilliantly, but James had won by the narrowest of margins. Based on the overall emotional impact of his complete meal, Marcus nodded, understanding what she meant. He asked her a question that had been forming in his thoughts. In her 20 years of judging, had she seen many cooks like James, people who created that kind of profound connection through food without formal training? Catherine considered this carefully before answering. She said that James was rare, perhaps unique, but not because he lacked training. His training had just been different, less structured, but perhaps more meaningful, because it had been driven purely by passion rather than career ambition. She told Marcus something she had never said to him before. His cooking was extraordinary, world-class in every technical sense. But she had noticed over the years that it had become increasingly perfect and increasingly safe. He never took risks anymore, never surprised anyone, because he was protecting his reputation rather than pursuing his art. Tonight, losing to James might be the best thing that could happen to him as a chef, if he allowed it to teach him rather than defeat him. Marcus thanked her for her honesty, recognizing the gift she had given him. Not many people in his world would risk telling him uncomfortable truths. As she left, he sat alone again, this time with a sense of possibility rather than defeat. The competition had ended, but something else was beginning. Something he could not yet name, but could feel taking shape in his mind like a recipe still being developed. He finally stood, stretching muscles stiff from hours of cooking and sitting. As he walked through the empty convention center, toward the exit, he passed the stage where the cooking stations still stood. He paused, looking at the space where he had expected an easy victory and instead had received an education. He smiled, surprising himself, and walked out into the cool night air, feeling lighter than he had in years. The street outside was quiet, the crowds long dispersed. Marcus's driver waited by the car, but Marcus waved him off, saying he wanted to walk. The driver looked concerned, but knew better than to argue with his employer. Marcus set off alone through the city's streets, his chef's coat still on, his mind full of plans and possibilities that had nothing to do with maintaining his reputation and everything to do with rediscovering his passion somewhere across the city. James sat in a modest apartment with fellow guards, sharing stories and laughter over simple beer and pizza. The trophy sat on his kitchen counter, catching the light from the overhead bulb, but it was not the trophy he kept looking at. It was his phone, where Marcus Chen's number was saved, representing a future he had never imagined possible. Tomorrow, he would return to his guard duties, standing watch at the palace. But now he knew that his secret passion was no longer secret, and the door to a new life had cracked open just enough to let in light. 3 months had passed since the competition, and autumn had painted the city in shades of gold and crimson. Marcus stood in the kitchen of his flagship restaurant, but everything felt different now. The space was the same, the stainless steel gleaming under bright lights, the sounds of cooking filling the air with familiar rhythm. What had changed was Marcus himself, and that transformation was evident in ways both subtle and profound. He had spent the weeks following his loss in deep reflection, questioning everything he thought he knew about success and mastery. His restaurants continued to operate at their usual high standards. The Michelin stars still gleamed on the walls, and reservations remained impossible to secure. But Marcus had begun making changes, small at first, then increasingly bold. He had started cooking staff meals himself, something he had not done in years. The sous chefs and line cooks had been surprised when Marcus announced he would prepare their dinner each night before service. Even more surprising was what he made: simple, honest food that reminded them why they had become cooks. Roasted chicken with herbs, perfectly cooked pasta with seasonal vegetables, soups that warmed from the inside out. No foams, no molecular gastronomy, no architectural presentations, just good food made with care. The staff responded to these meals with enthusiasm that exceeded their reactions to the elaborate tasting menus they prepared for guests. They gathered around the large prep table, sharing food and stories, and Marcus listened more than he talked. He learned about their lives, their struggles, their dreams. He discovered that his young pastry chef was supporting 3 younger siblings through school. His fish cook was saving money to open a small restaurant in his hometown. His sous chef had been working on a cookbook for 2 years, but was too afraid to show anyone. Marcus began mentoring his staff differently, teaching them not just techniques but philosophy. He shared the lesson he had learned from James, that cooking was ultimately about connection and service. Technical skill mattered, but it was meaningless without heart. He encouraged them to cook the food they loved, not just the food that would impress critics. The energy in his kitchens shifted, becoming warmer and more collaborative. True to his word, Marcus had reached out to James the week after the competition. They had met on James's day off, in Marcus's home kitchen, rather than any of his restaurants. Marcus wanted privacy, away from staff and critics and expectations. James arrived in civilian clothes, looking younger and more relaxed than he had in his ceremonial uniform. They cooked together for hours, sharing techniques and stories. Marcus taught James about mother sauces and proper knife skills. James showed Marcus the way Chef Marie had taught him to season by taste and instinct rather than precise measurement. They made mistakes and laughed about them. They debated the proper way to roast vegetables. They tasted everything multiple times, adjusting and improving. These sessions became weekly events, then twice weekly. They developed a friendship that surprised both of them. 2 men from completely different worlds finding common ground in their shared love of food. Marcus discovered that teaching James brought him more satisfaction than winning awards. James discovered that learning from Marcus deepened his understanding without diminishing his natural instincts. During one of these sessions, Marcus proposed an idea that had been forming in his mind. He wanted to open a new restaurant, something completely different from his existing establishments. Not another temple to fine dining, but a place that honored the kind of cooking James represented. Simple, seasonal, honest food, served in a warm environment where people felt welcomed rather than intimidated. He wanted James to be his partner in this venture. James was overwhelmed by the offer, insisting he was not qualified to run a restaurant. But Marcus persisted, explaining that James had exactly what was needed: the heart and soul that would make the place special. Marcus would handle the business aspects and provide technical training. Together, they would create something that combined Marcus's expertise with James's authentic approach to cooking. They would call it the Guards Table, honoring James's military service and the idea of cooking as an act of protection and care. The news of Marcus Chen opening a casual restaurant with the palace guard who had defeated him created immediate buzz in the food world. Some critics called it a publicity stunt, a way for Marcus to capitalize on his loss. Others saw it as an exciting evolution, a master chef humble enough to learn from unexpected sources. Investors lined up, eager to be part of what promised to be the most talked-about opening of the year, but Marcus and James moved forward at their own pace. Refusing to rush or compromise their vision, they spent months developing the menu, testing recipes, arguing about dishes and decorations and pricing. James learned about food costs and labor percentages. Marcus relearned how to cook without worrying about what critics would write. They hired staff who valued passion over pedigree, including several veterans from James's charity who wanted to work in kitchens. The restaurant space they chose was in a neighborhood, far from the upscale districts where Marcus's other establishments thrived. It was a community area, working class, diverse. It's the kind of place where people ate to live rather than living to eat at famous restaurants. The space had been a family diner for 40 years before closing, and they restored it with respect for its history, keeping the original wooden booths and adding warmth through careful lighting and simple decorations. James continued his guard duties at the palace, but he had requested a schedule change that allowed him to work at the restaurant during evenings and weekends. His fellow guards had become his biggest supporters, proud that one of their own had achieved something remarkable. Several of them helped with construction during the restaurant renovation, refusing payment and simply wanting to contribute to James's dream. Catherine, the head judge from the competition, visited the restaurant site several times during preparation. She had become an unofficial advisor, offering suggestions and encouragement. She told anyone who asked that she was more excited about the guards' table than any fine dining opening in recent memory. Food was cyclical, she explained. The world had spent years chasing innovation in molecular gastronomy. Now people were hungry for authenticity and connection. Exactly what this restaurant promised to deliver. Opening night arrived on a crisp evening in late autumn. Marcus and James stood together in the kitchen, surveying their domain. The menu was simple: 6 appetizers, 8 main courses, 4 desserts. Everything they had chosen told a story, represented a lesson learned, honored a teacher or memory. There was James's roasted chicken, of course, prepared exactly as he had made it during the competition. There was a version of Marcus's grandmother's dumpling soup, a dish he had not made in 20 years. There were dishes inspired by Chef Marie's teaching, by the palace kitchen staff, by Marcus's travels and James's experiments. The dining room filled quickly with an unusual mix of people. Food critics sat beside palace guards. Marcus's fellow celebrity chefs shared tables with James's military colleagues. Regular neighborhood residents who had loved the old diner mixed with food enthusiasts who had traveled from across the country. The atmosphere was unlike any restaurant opening Marcus had ever experienced. Less performance and more celebration. The first orders came through, and Marcus and James worked side by side in the kitchen they had designed together. The other cooks moved around them with practiced efficiency. But the partnership between the master chef and the palace guard was the heart of the operation. Marcus plated with his characteristic precision, but now his dishes had the warmth that came from cooking with purpose rather than perfection. James cooked with his natural care and attention, but now his technique had improved through Marcus's patient teaching. The first reviews came back through the waitstaff, and they were glowing. Not the analytical praise of food critics, but the genuine appreciation of people enjoying excellent food in comfortable surroundings. Guests were returning their empty plates, asking to compliment the chefs, taking photos not for social media bragging, but to remember the experience. This was what success looked like when measured in satisfaction rather than stars. Late into the night, after the last guests had left and the kitchen was cleaned, Marcus and James sat at a corner table sharing a simple meal. They were exhausted, their feet ached, their chef coats were stained from a busy service. But they were happy in a way that transcended any professional achievement. They had created something meaningful together, something that honored food and community. And the act of caring for people through cooking, Marcus thought about the competition. About that moment when James's first course had shocked the judges and planted the seed of doubt in his mind. At the time, it had felt like defeat, like everything he had worked for was being questioned. Now he understood it had been a gift, a wake-up call that had arrived exactly when he needed it. He had not really lost that night. He had been redirected, pointed toward a path he would never have found on his own. James looked around the restaurant they had built together, still hardly believing this was real. A year ago, he had been a palace guard with a secret passion, cooking in his small apartment and dreaming of impossible things. Now he was a restaurant owner, partner to one of the most famous chefs in the country, living a life he had never imagined possible. The competition had changed everything, but more than winning the trophy. He had gained a mentor, a friend, and validation that his approach to cooking had value. They talked about the future, about expanding the menu seasonally, about maybe writing a cookbook together that would combine technique and soul. They discussed cooking classes they could offer, teaching people that good cooking was accessible to everyone who approached it with care and attention. They imagined a world where more restaurants valued connection over complexity, where success was measured in satisfied guests rather than critical acclaim. As they prepared to leave, locking up the restaurant that bore James's military heritage in its name, Marcus paused at the door. He looked back at the dining room, at the kitchen visible through the service window, at everything they had built. He realized that this modest neighborhood restaurant made him prouder than any Michelin star he had ever earned. This was cooking as it was meant to be. Generous, honest, in service of bringing people together. They walked out into the cool night, the city quiet around them. James would return to his guard post at the palace in a few hours, standing watch with the same discipline he always brought to his duties. Marcus would check on his other restaurants, ensuring they maintained the standards that had built his reputation. But they would both return here, to the guards' table, to continue building something that mattered more than fame or recognition. The competition that had brought them together was already becoming legend in culinary circles. The story told and retold about the palace guard who defeated the master chef, but for Marcus and James, the competition was just the beginning, not the ending. It was the moment when their paths crossed, when both of them learned that mastery could wear different faces. When they discovered that sometimes losing was the only way to win what truly mattered, the restaurant's sign glowed softly in the darkness as they parted ways, each heading to their respective responsibilities. The guards' table would open again tomorrow, and the day after that, and for years to come. It would serve thousands of meals, create countless memories, and stand as proof that the best cooking came not from ego or ambition, but from the simple desire to care for people through food. The master and the guard had both found what they were seeking, not through competition, but through collaboration, not through winning, but through the willingness to learn and grow and remember why they had started cooking in the first place.